I froze the moment my dad said it, his voice calm, almost amused. "We're proud to have raised our landlord." For a heartbeat, I couldn't tell if it was sarcasm or surrender. The air between us felt heavier than all the years of their doubt combined. They had once laughed at me for dreaming too big, told me I'd never afford a home before 35. Now they were paying me rent, on time, every month. But that night, as I stood in the doorway of the house they used to own, something shifted forever. And what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. My name's Haley. I'm 25, and I'll never forget the exact sound of my father's laughter that night. That low, confident chuckle that carried the weight of certainty. The kind that says, "I know the world better than you ever will." I had just told my parents that I wanted to buy a house before I turned 26. I wasn't joking, I wasn't daydreaming, I meant it. I said it with the kind of conviction that comes from too many nights behind a counter, pouring burnt coffee for strangers who called me sweetheart and left coins instead of bills. But to them, it was a punchline. At that time, I was working double shifts at Harrison's Diner, a place that smelled permanently of grease and burnt toast. The tiles were chipped, the lights buzzed, and the coffee machine hissed like a living thing on its last breath. I served breakfast at 6 a.m., clocked out at 2, came back at 6, and stayed until midnight. Sometimes longer. On the best nights, I went home with $80 in tips, on the worst, barely 30. My hands were always dry from soap, my legs sore, my eyes hollow. I barely slept. But I was moving, not fast, not visibly, but forward. Meanwhile, my parents, Mark and Susan, lived a life built entirely on comfort. My dad was a financial advisor, the kind who wore pressed shirts and lectured others about long-term strategy, while refinancing his own debts every 2 years. My mom ran a travel blog that she treated like gospel. Wanderlust wisdom, she called it. Every few weeks, she posted photos from some new destination. Bali, Venice, Santorini, all filtered sunlight and captions about gratitude. I'd scroll through them during my 10-minute breaks, wiping syrup off my apron, reading her lines about living your truth and trusting the journey. Their life was glossy, mine was fluorescent and sticky. The night I told them my plan, we were sitting in their kitchen, a cathedral of marble countertops and imported appliances that they'd barely used. Dad was sipping wine, scrolling through his tablet. Mom was editing photos for her next post. I told them, calm and direct, that I wanted to buy a house before 26. Dad didn't even look up at first. Then came that chuckle, low and paternal. "Sweetheart, you'll never afford a place before you're 35, he said, smirking. "You're not. Built for that kind of grind." Mom gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind that made it worse. "Focus on something realistic, honey. We'll help you rent a small apartment if you want. Maybe near downtown. Something manageable." Manageable, that word lingered. Manageable as in limited. As in you should know your place. It wasn't disbelief. It was mockery wrapped in the silk of concern. They didn't even argue. They dismissed. They believed their laughter was harmless, maybe even motivating, but it wasn't. It was a verdict. After that, every holiday dinner became a showcase of subtle condescension. Dad would raise his glass and say, "Still saving for that big dream, Haley. How many hash browns to go?" Mom would laugh and add, "Don't forget to save for that imaginary down payment." Every word was a reminder that they didn't just doubt me, they enjoyed doubting me. My ambition had become their running joke. But what they didn't realize was that those little jokes hit harder than they thought. They didn't crush me, they calcified me. I started noticing things about them that I hadn't before. The hypocrisy. The way they preached about financial responsibility yet carried 3 credit cards each. The way Dad called himself a smart investor while refinancing to cover another vacation. The way Mom claimed to live within her means while posting pictures of her 4th new designer bag that year. They weren't mentors, they were spenders playing the role of teachers, and I was the quiet student who finally saw through the act. One night, after a brutal 16-hour shift, a double that turned into a triple when the night waitress called in sick, I sat in my car outside the diner. My body felt hollow, my head heavy, my uniform damp with the smell of fries and sweat. The neon sign above me flickered like it was dying too. I stared at the steering wheel, at the tiny cracks in the plastic, and heard my father's voice again. "You're not built for that kind of grind." That was the moment something inside me snapped, but not in anger. It was quieter than that. Colder. I didn't cry, I just smiled. a small bitter smile that tasted like steel. Because suddenly I understood what they couldn't. They had never been tested. Their confidence was built on comfort, not endurance. They believed I couldn't grind because they never had to. Sitting there, my hands trembling from caffeine and exhaustion, I whispered something out loud, something that surprised even me. "I'll buy your house one day." The words felt ridiculous at first, but also electric. I could almost see it, their faces when I'd walk through the door, not as their daughter, but as the owner. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming worth. About proving that being underestimated was the best advantage anyone could ever give me. I started the car, the engine coughing like it shared my fatigue, and drove home under the dull hum of streetlights. My reflection in the windshield looked older than 23, tired but sharper, like a blade that had been forged in fire. That night didn't make me rich, but it made me dangerous. It gave me focus sharper than hunger. Because when people laugh at you long enough, you either shrink, or you build something they can't laugh at anymore. And I knew from that moment on I was done being their punchline. Over the next 2 years, my life turned into a quiet war. No banners, no speeches, just the grind of discipline pressed against bone. I measured days not by sunrises but by clockouts and clock-ins, by the ache of arches and cheap sneakers, and the weight of an apron that smelled like syrup long after it had been washed. A double shift was standard. A triple happened often enough that my manager started keeping a pot of extra strong coffee in the back and labeling it Haley's jet fuel. I learned how to stand perfectly still during slow hours to save energy, how to stack plates so my forearms did the work instead of my wrists, how to breathe through the annoyance of customers who snapped their fingers like I was a remote control. At home, I engineered a life that didn't leak. I canceled every subscription and taught myself to love the library's dust and silence. I tracked expenses with the precision of a surgeon: rent, utilities, bus pass, groceries. I switched to cash envelopes because swiping a card was too frictionless, too forgiving. For meals, it was ramen, eggs, beans, rice, paired with whatever the discount racks surrendered: bruised apples, fading spinach, a bag of carrots with one split down the middle like a healed scar. I learned to stretch a rotisserie chicken into 4 meals, to turn coffee grounds over for a second brew, to calculate unit cost in my head while a line formed behind me at the store. Every spare minute was tuition. I devoured real estate books that read like legal puzzles, listened to podcasts that broke down debt-to-income ratios and loan programs. FHA, USDA, conventional with 3% down if you could justify it and your credit profile didn't flinch. At 3 a.m., when the apartment was a cave of humming appliances and I was too wired to sleep, I watched videos on cap rates, comparables, inspection red flags, foundation hairlines that betrayed hydrostatic pressure, roofs bluffing decay with fresh paint, HVAC units that whined like dogs because their bearings were going. I learned acronyms until my brain felt laminated: LTV, PMI, DTI, ARV. I ran my numbers out loud like prayers: rent potential, property taxes, insurance, vacancy, repairs, reserves. If I couldn't say the math in one breath, I didn't trust it. I built my credit the way you build a bridge over a gorge, slowly, check by check. I paid off a lingering medical bill from a college ER visit that had been hanging like a storm cloud. I opened a secured card and never used more than 7% of its limit. I set alarms on my phone for every due date and then paid early so the statement would report low. I disputed a wrong address on an old file out of pure stubbornness. When the bureau corrected it, my score jumped 6 points and I smiled into my pillow like a thief who just stole time. While my friends posted group photos from bars and weddings with captions about living their best lives, I learned to savor a different kind of pleasure. A spreadsheet turning from red to black, a savings transfer clearing, an interest rate 1/4 point lower than the national average because I had hunted for lender credits until someone blinked. When a regular at the diner, a contractor named Phil, heard me mutter something about property taxes, he taught me how to read county records like autopsy reports: sales history, liens, delinquencies, the stale breath of overleveraged pride. Then the crash hit, not a headline but a slow-motion bruise spreading across everything. The travel industry stuttered, then coughed, then sat down hard. My mother's blog posts became a patchwork of throwbacks and recycled tips repackaged as evergreen, but even I could hear the hollowness. Airlines slashed routes, boutique hotels blowed, affiliate links turned to dust. My father, who liked to say volatility was just opportunity in disguise, started using more cautious verbs on the phone, then fewer words, then none. When I visited, the house smelled the same: lemongrass diffuser, lemon cleaner, but the air had that stretched quiet that follows a slammed door. Their mortgage, locked in during a peak when money felt like a river, began to bite. The adjustable rate adjusted up at the worst possible time. I saw the edges of their confidence fray. My mother's eyes stayed too bright during dinner. My father checked his phone like he expected it to apologize. They still hosted with matching napkins and poured good wine, but the second bottle remained unopened on the counter, like a ritual they were choosing not to perform. I noticed little omissions: a delayed landscaping service, a postponed deck repair. My mother mentioned casually that the euro felt expensive this year. My father joked about camping being the new Bali. Underneath, fear moved like groundwater, invisible but saturating. One evening, I stopped by with a bag of groceries under the pretext of making dinner. I made carbonara without the pancetta, eggs, parmesan, black pepper, a cheap comfort, and watched my parents move around each other like people learning a new dance. After we ate, my father leaned back, exhaled, and let the mask fall half an inch. "We might sell the house soon," he said, as if confessing to an affair. "The market's terrible, we have no choice." My mother stared at her fork as if it might start speaking. My heart stuttered, then steadied, then slipped into an athlete's calm. Every impulse screamed to react, to rush, to comfort, to explain that I had a plan, but my voice came out even. "That's rough, Dad. Let me know when you list it." I kept my eyes on a knot in the table, small, centered, perfect. I had been saving for exactly this moment, without saying it out loud, without even letting the full shape of it bloom in my mind. I knew that hoping was dangerous. Preparation was safer. The next morning, I made another payment to savings and increased the automatic transfer by $20. I called my bank and asked the same questions again, this time taking neater notes. I verified my pre-approval would still hold if rates jumped half a point. I asked for itemized closing cost estimates and then cross-checked them against 3 other lenders. I circled numbers that felt like traps: origination, underwriting, discount, flood cert, title, recording. I called the county assessor and confirmed the millage rate. I looked up the school district's rating even though I had no kids. Buyers cared, and buyers mattered to future value. When the listing went live, I saw it before my parents called. The photos were careful: wide-angle lenses, blown-out windows, deliberate angles that hid the sun damage on the dining room floor. I recognized the photographer's style and the way the agent's copy hit its beats: light-filled, chef's kitchen, entertainer's deck. The asking price dropped like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't just lower than they'd dreamed, it was low enough to make my fingers shake. Markets punish vanity and reward patience. I had learned that in the quiet hours. I contacted the realtor first: professional email, succinct, pre-approval attached, proof of funds for the down payment scanned and labeled. I requested the seller's disclosures: the age of the roof, the service records for the HVAC. I asked about the sump pump because the neighborhood sat in a shallow bowl and heavy rains pooled like unshed tears. I confirmed the listing hadn't received multiple offers. The agent's pause gave me the answer. Then I moved money like a general moves troops: savings to escrow, micro-investment gains liquidated without sentiment, a small sliver of index funds sold even though I hated the timing. I accepted that perfection is the enemy of arrival. The first-time buyer loans slotted into place like a final piece in a stubborn puzzle. The underwriter flagged a $20 overdraft fee from 14 months ago, and I wrote a letter of explanation that could have doubled as a character witness. My manager at the diner verified my employment with a curt phone call and then slipped a free slice of pie into my bag during break. I ate it standing up and tasted sugar, relief, and a new fear. What if I actually do this? I ran numbers again with brutal honesty. PITI, reserves, a maintenance buffer calculated at 1% of value per year, even though the water heater was only 3 years old. I called Phil to ask whether a hairline in the garage slab was cosmetic or a prophecy. He drove by at dusk, took one look, and grunted, "Cosmetic." I slept 4 hours, dreamed I missed an email, woke to find the email had arrived and my inbox had not betrayed me. When my offer was accepted, the notification pinged like a door unlocking inside my chest. I didn't shout. I didn't call anyone. I sat down on the floor of my empty apartment because the chair felt too ceremonial, and I cried for the first time in years, not from sadness, but from the pure disorienting physics of disbelief colliding with victory. Every coupon clipped, every night bus taken, every terrible tip swallowed, every spreadsheet cell adjusted by a nickel, that was the currency of this moment. The war wasn't glamorous, but it was precise, and precision had finally paid. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand, stood, and opened my notebook to a clean page. There were inspections to schedule, contingencies to track, documents to upload with the exact file names lenders like to see. The celebration could wait. The work would not. When the sale closed, I didn't tell my parents immediately. I let the knowledge sit in my chest like a secret ember, glowing quietly beneath the surface of my calm. The documents arrived in neat digital folders: title deed, mortgage note, closing statement, all bearing my name, Haley Miller, in the corner where I had once seen theirs. The signature line where my father's name used to rest was now mine, and when I scrolled through the final pages, the sight of it made my throat tighten. For the first time in my life, I owned something they didn't. For a week, I said nothing. I watched them post photos of new beginnings on social media, pretending optimism. Bittersweet letting go of our family home, but looking forward to adventures ahead. My mother's caption was written in her usual bright tone, paired with a photo of her and my father standing on the front porch, holding hands like everything was under control. But I could see it, the stiffness in his jaw, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes. Behind the filtered sunlight was fear. They weren't selling a house, they were surrendering an illusion. The agent told them the buyer wished to remain anonymous until the lease signing. That small detail was my request. I wanted to see it, the exact moment the truth would settle on their faces. When I finally called, I kept my tone even. "Hey Mom, Dad, the new owner wants to rent the place back to you while you figure out your next move." I said I'd bring the lease over for them. They didn't suspect a thing. They sounded relieved. My mother thanked me like I'd just offered to drive them to the airport. My father, ever the analyst, said, "Smart investor, whoever they are. Timing's terrible, but buying in a down market is the move." A week later, they arrived at the property. The house looked different, emptier somehow, though nothing had changed. The air carried that strange echo that lingers after furniture is moved, even if the walls still stand. My mother trailed her fingers along the banister like she was memorizing it. My father stood tall, scanning the living room as if mentally calculating appreciation percentages. "The new owner must be smart," he said, almost proudly. "Snapped it up fast." I nodded. "Yeah, pretty fast." We gathered around the dining table, the one they'd chosen from a catalog years ago, the one I'd eaten on through countless dinners filled with subtle lectures and long silences. I opened the folder and slid the lease across to them. They leaned in, eyes skimming the first few lines casually, until they reached the name on the top. My mother's voice came out in a whisper, thin as thread. "Haley, this is your name." My father's eyes lifted to mine, and for a second, he looked like someone trying to solve an equation that couldn't possibly add up. "You bought the house?" I met his stare without blinking. "Yes, you said I couldn't afford a place before 35. Guess I'm 10 years early." The silence that followed was not quiet. It hummed. The kind of silence that holds all the unsaid apologies, the disbelief, the quiet shame that doesn't yet know where to hide. My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. My father's jaw shifted once, twice, before he found words that fell out like gravel. "You bought our house." Our. The word caught in my ears. Ownership had always been theirs, of property, of narrative, of power. But now the balance had inverted. For the first time, the floor belonged to me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Triumph felt too loud for that moment. What I felt was deeper, solid, unmoving like bedrock. They sat back in their chairs, and I could see them trying to make sense of it, searching for some flaw in the story that might make it less true. Maybe they thought I had a secret benefactor, or a stroke of luck, or some trick that made it possible. But there was no trick, just years of grind, discipline, and quiet defiance. My mother was the first to recover. Her eyes softened, though her hands trembled as she held the pen. "Haley, we didn't mean—" "I know," I interrupted gently. "You just didn't believe me." She nodded, tears building but refusing to fall. My father said nothing. The man who once boasted about teaching me the value of money now stared at the contract like it was a mirror he didn't want to face. His pride, the same one that built their lifestyle, was now the wall between us. When they finally signed, the sound of their pens scratching paper was sharp and slow, deliberate. My mother's hand hesitated over each letter of her name. My father's signature was quicker, smaller than usual, as though shrinking from the line itself. They slid the papers back toward me, and I placed them neatly in the folder. That was it. The transfer was complete, not just of ownership, but of legacy. Outside, twilight was spreading over the yard, painting everything in muted gold. My mother walked through the living room one last time, touching the walls, the edges of window frames, the ghost of memory. My father lingered by the door, glancing once at the for sale sign now gone, replaced by a simple for rent. When they turned back toward me, there was no anger left, just quiet defeat dressed in politeness. That night, they moved their suitcases into my home, their former bedroom now legally mine. Watching them cross that threshold was like watching time reverse. I thought I would feel satisfaction, maybe vindication. Instead, I felt the strange weight of closure pressing against my ribs. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still, hands steady, while others realize what they lost. And as they unpacked in silence, I stood in the hallway, the owner of the same walls that once echoed with their laughter at my expense. The air smelled faintly of the past, lemons, dust, and irony. The first few months felt like walking through a house haunted by living ghosts. The walls remembered laughter that didn't belong to me anymore, and the air carried the faint static of unspoken things. Every morning I'd wake to the quiet buzz of an automated deposit notification. Mark and Susan Miller, $2,450, rent for month. Sometimes my dad added a note, a small defense mechanism disguised as practicality. For maintenance, for property tax. Hope you're saving wisely. Each message was another echo of who he used to be, the teacher lecturing the student who had already surpassed him. I never replied. I didn't gloat. I didn't send back a thank you or a smirk or type something cruel like funny how that works, huh? I just let the numbers move quietly between us, a monthly handshake through the cold circuitry of a banking app. Their rent became the rhythm of my life, but I never let it become revenge. If I had learned anything from them, it was that pride rots fastest when it goes unexamined. Instead, I worked. I kept my job at the diner longer than I needed to, stacking side income into savings until it started to feel less like survival and more like architecture, the kind of structure built not from luck, but from repetition. I invested carefully, nothing flashy. I read contracts line by line and found comfort in the precision of details. I painted the kitchen myself, learning how much a gallon of eggshell white could change a room's temperature. I trimmed the hedges they'd once paid a gardener for and found satisfaction in the crisp, clean order of straight lines. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about keeping my hands on the work, staying grounded in the life I had built with no audience, no applause. But awkwardness still followed us like static. We crossed paths in shared spaces, the mailbox, the driveway, the front porch where my mother still liked to sip her morning tea. Conversations were short, polite, wrapped in the gauze of civility. How's work? Weather's turning nice. Your garden looks good. Underneath, there was an ache, the slow recognition that our roles had shifted forever. And none of us quite knew the choreography of this new dance. My father especially, he carried his discomfort like a stiff collar. He was still proud, still disciplined, but there was a quiet erosion behind his eyes. Every time he sent me rent, I could sense the friction between who he had been, the provider, the voice of authority, and who he was now, a man living in the home his daughter owned. That dynamic wore on him like invisible debt. And my mother, she softened before he did. She'd leave small gestures around the house, a freshly baked pie on the counter, folded towels by the dryer, a new welcome mat that simply said home. I think it was her way of negotiating peace without words. Months passed, the seasons rolled through the house differently now, less grand, more honest. I noticed how fall light spilled across the hardwood floors, how winter silence pressed against the windows like frost. I wasn't a guest anymore, and I wasn't a daughter seeking approval. I was a caretaker, not just of the property, but of something more fragile, the fragile truce between our past and what stood in its place. Then one evening it changed. It was late February, one of those damp nights when rain sounds like static against the gutters. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Dinner tonight? Just the three of us. No occasion, just dinner. I hesitated. We hadn't eaten together properly since before the sale. But something about her wording, simple, almost humble, made me go. When I arrived, she had cooked her old signature dish, lemon chicken with rosemary and roasted potatoes. The smell hit me like nostalgia soaked in olive oil and heat. The table was set the way it always had been when I was a child: candles, cloth napkins, no screens in sight. But the atmosphere was different now, quieter. We ate mostly in silence, forks against plates, rain against windows. Halfway through the meal, Mom set her fork down and looked at me. Really looked at me, not as her child, not as a reminder of her own pride, but as someone entirely separate. "Haley," she said softly, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard before, "we underestimated you. You saw what we couldn't. You worked for it. We're proud of you, even if we handled it badly." For a moment I couldn't speak. Her words didn't feel rehearsed or diplomatic. They were raw, unguarded. My father didn't interrupt her. He just sat there, elbows on the table, hands clasped together, eyes focused somewhere between me and the candlelight. Finally, he exhaled, long and steady. "You proved me wrong, kid," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching toward something that wasn't quite a smile. "Guess you were built for the grind after all." It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no movie moment of reconciliation. Just three people sitting around a table that had once been an arena, now finally quiet. For the first time, their words didn't sting. They didn't sound like lectures or judgments or backhanded praise. They sounded human. I looked at them, at the silver in my father's hair, the fine lines near my mother's eyes, the worn hands that had once built the world I came from, and felt something shift inside me. The resentment I'd been carrying for years, the one that had driven me, that had shaped every decision, began to dissolve. Not vanish, but melt, slow, inevitable, like winter surrendering to spring. I realized then that forgiveness isn't something you hand over like a gift. It's something that grows in the quiet spaces between understanding and time. That night, when I walked back to my own side of the house, my house, I felt lighter. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to. Their pride had finally made room for respect, and my anger had finally made room for peace. For the first time in years, our story didn't feel like a competition. It felt like closure. Now I'm 25, a homeowner, the deed filed under my name in the county archive with the blunt finality of ink and statute. Every first of the month arrives like a bell you can set your life to: automated transfers, ledger entries that balance with the calm rhythm of a heart at rest. The landlords who once laughed at me pay rent, on time, every month. There's no gloating in the notification ding, there's administration. I open the property folder, budgets, rental, received, and drop the PDF receipt into place. The spreadsheet tallies PITI, reserves, maintenance, taxes, and each line carries its own story. A furnace tune-up in November. Vetter guards installed after a squirrel learned the roofline too well. A contingency fund fed by discipline, not luck. Ownership properly done is a lifestyle of checklists. I renovated the place not to erase what it was, but to make it honest. Paint first, the kitchen's tired beige gave way to a soft eggshell that throws light forward even on weak morning days. The cabinets, scuffed by years of gentle neglect, accepted a satin finish like they'd been waiting for permission to glow. I replaced the brass knobs with matte black pulls and felt the room exhale, less show, more purpose. In the hallway, I pulled up a narrow strip of lifting laminate to find the original hardwood beneath, worn but not defeated. I sanded, wiped the dust in slow, reverent arcs, and chose a water-based poly that left the grain visible, the house's memory intact. I learned to love the tap of a hammer setting a finish nail just so, the modest authority of a torpedo level, the humility of caulk lines smoothed with a damp finger and patience. The airmim conversion wasn't a whim, it was a model. I carved the back suite off with a lockable, code-compliant door, installed a sound-dampening strip, and separated the HVAC returns so airflow wouldn't be a conversation. Fire extinguishers mounted at eye height, smoke and CO combination detectors networked and tested, a small kitchenette with induction plates, a compact sink, a microwave that doesn't hum like a tractor, and a mini fridge that holds a week of groceries for two if you're intentional. I walked the space at night, lights off, to find the tripping hazards guests would discover. I taped and tucked and trimmed until the path from bed to bathroom was a straight, safe whisper. I left a binder, house rules, emergency contacts, transit options, a list of local businesses owned by women who keep their doors open through grit. The seamstress who hems in an hour, the cafe with the barista who remembers names, the bike shop that tunes for the price of a conversation. The guest book surprised me. I expected reviews. I didn't expect stories. A nurse from Arizona who came to see her father through a surgery and wrote, in a small, careful hand, that the bed felt like a real bed, not a compromise. A graduate student who passed her defense and celebrated with the quietest slice of grocery store cake, leaving 2 pieces wrapped in foil as thanks for the lamp that's bright enough to believe in. A couple in their 60s who road-tripped because they decided it was time to see what they had postponed for decades. They underlined a line in the binder, "Checkout is at 11 a.m., leave the key in the lockbox," and added, "We left at 10:45. For once, we were early." Systems grew around the business like good trellises around vining fruit. Arrival messages triggered 48 hours before check-in, a day of reminder with gate code and parking map, a mid-stay note that asked not everything okay, but anything specific we can improve. Cleaning checklists with boxes that forced attention, baseboard dust, shower grout, remote batteries, quarterly deep cleans with tasks that feel like devotion, flip the mattress, launder the duvet insert, descale the kettle, pull the fridge, and sweep the unglamorous stripe of dust that lives behind every appliance in America. I built a calendar in color blocks: tenant rent, airman turnover, contractor windows, my own work hours, 1 square a week labeled walkthrough in a green that means yes. Vigilance is the kindness housework pays forward. I started mentoring other young women quietly, the way careful habits begin: 1 conversation in a coffee shop, then a second on a lunch break stoop, and then a monthly evening where we circled folding chairs in the basement community room of the library. I printed a 1-page template: income, non-negotiables, debts, emergency fund, credit profile, timeline. I told them credit isn't a personality test. It's a report card for a system that assumes you won't pay attention. We pulled free reports and highlighted errors like detectives, mailed dispute letters with certified tracking, explained the trick of utilization under 10%, the difference between due date and statement date, why paid in full means reported small. We role-played conversations with lenders, the script for asking about discount points without being sold, the right questions for understanding closing costs. What's lender imposed? What's third party? What's room to move? We practiced no to fees that pretend to be laws, no to it's just how it's done, no to shame about starting with small numbers that add up. Skeptics came too, carrying the heavy certainty of other people's limits. I didn't argue with them. I handed them 3 exercises: track every expense for 2 weeks with impolite honesty, call a bank and ask 3 precise questions they were sure they weren't qualified to ask, then make a mock budget for a $500 emergency. 2 came back annoyed, 1 came back transformed. The transformed one brought her sister the next month, and they sat with matching notebooks and matching quiet, and when they spoke, it wasn't about inspiration. It was about dates and amounts and an acceptance letter from a credit union that didn't think of them as a risk but as clients. Sometimes I walk past my parents' old bedroom, now painted the color of mourning, and I smile, not out of spite but gratitude. The room still remembers their lamps, the groove where the dresser sat, the fine half-moons the bed feet pressed into the floor. They taught me financial theory, compounding, diversification, long-term horizon, those elegant abstractions that dissolve on contact with a paycheck that has already been claimed by rent and groceries. I taught myself reality: envelopes that seal because you decided they would, interest rates negotiated because you asked, inspections that catch the leak under the vanity before it becomes black mold, a reserve account that grows 1 unglamorous $100 at a time until it is a wall nothing can push through. Their doubt was a kiln. I came out tempered. The house is different in my hands. Weekends carry the sound of a small cordless drill rather than hired crews. I replace a leaky P-trap and learn that Teflon tape is forgiveness in spool form. I oil the door hinges and the hallway stops squeaking like a confession. I label the breaker box in a neat block print: kitchen Gave primary bedroom north wall, exterior east outlet, and take an unreasonable pride in knowing which switch is which. I touch the water shutoff valve once a month to make sure it still turns. I keep a flashlight in the entry closet, fresh batteries dated with a Sharpie. Preparedness is the opposite of fear. It is the quiet faith that the future can be met, not fled. And yes, there is the twist, almost comic in its symmetry. Next month they're moving out to travel again. The calendar block is already there, a soft gray square with a note to do a walkthrough the day after. No drama, just logistics. But before the suitcases come out, my father said something that rebuilt the final broken beam between us. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen he used to ignore and watched me rehang a cabinet door with a slow, exact torque. "We're proud to have raised our landlord," he said, and his smile finally reached his eyes. I laughed for the first time in years, not because of them, but because something fundamental slid into place. I understood what all the numbers had been building toward. The best revenge isn't anger, it's ownership. Not just of property, but of process, of choices that align like framing studs, of time measured not by someone else's schedule but by your own priorities stacked in order. Ownership of silence that doesn't need to prove anything. Ownership of the work done when no one is watching, and the result that stands when everyone is. At night, when the airroom is booked and the main house is quiet, I walk the perimeter with a mug of tea and count the reliable things: fence pickets holding their line, downspouts fixed to grade, the porch light I replaced with an LED that will outlast trends. I turn the deadbolt and feel the smooth, oiled certainty of the latch catching home. Triumph, I've learned, isn't loud. It's the daily habit of being ready, and the humility to keep building.